Hi, my name is Rebecca Wiseman. I will be doing assignment 4 with my partner Grace Black. Grace will be primarily covering 12 Years a Slave, and I will be primarily covering Birth of a Nation. So, Birth of a Nation was a movie that came out in 2013, and it was about Nate Turner. And Nate Turner was a slave that happened to be literate and spoke the gospel. And it goes through the trials and tribulations of him being a slave until his ultimate death. 12 Years a Slave was a movie about a freed black man that was enslaved or abducted and kidnapped, and goes through the trials and tribulations of that. So how has slavery changed over the years, or how is it portrayed in movies? Well, prior to 2000, generally speaking, slavery was portrayed as there was slavery, then there was the end of slavery, and that's kind of what they focused on. A lot of what this movie focused on was being a slave, the brutality of it, the psychological effects. In Birth of a Nation, they go through, you have Nate Turner, and his slave owner is in need of money, so he takes Nate's ability to speak the gospel and to read, and pretty much sells him to other slave owners in order to speak the gospel and really manipulate it for unruly slaves to be able to adhere to what their slave owners want. And I think this is something very important because movies prior to this really didn't show the psychological effects. They didn't show the brutality and the physical effects the way that they do in this particular movie, but they certainly didn't show the psychological effects that Nate Turner went through this process. Here you have an individual that's a slave who understands what being a slave is and has to go through his own things of being a slave, but now you've put him in the position that he is manipulating other slaves and has to see the brutality of that. And that's something we quite haven't seen before. The changes about slavery that I think are most important to point out here is prior to 2000, generally speaking, slavery was kind of depicted as more immigration than it was slavery itself. That slaves were happy to be here, that this was giving them a different opportunity. And that's not what this movie shows. This movie shows being a slave. Other movies up until this point really focused on the freedom of slaves and what it meant and how they came to their freedom and what life was like after, and the rights and the different trials that they went through after. And this movie and 12 Years a Slave didn't focus on that. They focused on this is the brutality of slavery, and that made it as raw as it was. The presentation of slavery, both films showed extreme violence, brutality, torture. Particularly in Birth of a Nation, I almost stopped the movie at one point. They have a scene that they have a slave who is refusing to eat. This hit me on both parts because of the brutality of what happens next. But here it shows a man would rather starve to death than be a slave anymore. It goes on to show that they bash in his teeth and they put a funnel in his mouth to force feed him. Gut-wrenching. Those are things that we have never seen on TV before, that I've never seen on TV before. So it showed slavery in this very raw, brutal form that was not willing. You did not see happy slaves, jovial slaves, people that were happy to be there. You saw a very torturous environment. The film also shows suffering and depression. I think it was very well displayed on their faces and in the acting, the amount of depression and that the fact that they didn't want to be there and that this wasn't willing. I think so many other movies before this, Gone with the Wind, kind of made slavery okay. It wasn't that it was that bad. And this movie showed the fact that it was slavery. We were doing this against our will, and it was very brutal. The conclusion of both movies is slavery is depicted so differently now than what it was prior to 2000. I think a lot of that comes into play with police brutality, social media, Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of things that are going on socially now that are making it acceptable to bring to the forefront that these things really happened. We can no longer cover up history. We can no longer disguise it for something that it's not and make it something that was willingful. The motion picture industry before now either took a light heart approach to it or danced around it. And both of these films, 12 Years a Slave, with its massive amounts of brutality throughout it, and Birth of a Nation, which I think is not given enough recognition because it was an amazing movie, show this very honest, raw approach that we have never seen before. So I think that a lot of that is coming about because of everything that is going on in society, and that it's more acceptable, or we're more socially desensitized to some of the things that are happening. When you look at things that are happening in our media, like Trayvon Martin and different things like that, this isn't slavery. However, it is brutality against a certain race. So I think it's opening the doorway for it to be acceptable, to show slavery for what it is. And I think that that's very important. Grace will conclude on 12 Years a Slave. I just want to personally say thank you for letting me watch this movie, or making me watch this movie. I watched 12 Years a Slave the first time only about halfway through, and it kind of forced me to watch it all the way through. Birth of a Nation would not have been a movie that I'd even heard of other than the earlier version in the 1900s through different works. So this would not even have been a movie that I had watched. So I just want to say I really appreciate it. And it definitely was eye-opening, something that my older children I've shared with, because I think it's very important that we never lose sight to the effects that slavery has today and then has had on our past, and what it really meant. Thank you.